You're watching Beyond Markets. Welcome, I'm Kenneth Igbomo. Coming up on today's show, we will discuss cybercrime regulation in Nigeria. Don't forget, you can always join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag Beyond Markets and follow me at Kenneth Igbomo. The Central Bank of Nigeria is currently working on the modalities for new regulations to check cybercrime in Nigeria. I have with me in studio in Abuja, Abdul-Hakeem Ajijola is the Executive Chairman of Consultancy Support Services, and he joins me to discuss the best way to check cybercrime in Nigeria. Thank you for your time, Abdul-Hakeem.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I'd like to get from you, what do you think are some of the, the key issues to look at when, issues to factor in when you're looking at cybercrime regulation?
Well, first of all, I think it's commendable that the CBN is actually trying to strengthen, the regulatory framework. And I think many other similar regulatory agencies, both in Nigeria and around Africa, need to do likewise. I think we have to appreciate that as we grow from being babies to children to being teenagers to adults, there must be, our rules-based parameters must evolve also. So I think that it is clear that our cybersecurity situation and particularly our cybercrime circumstances have evolved and have matured. And in many ways, of course, the bad actors are also evolving and maturing as well. What I would like to say in a direct response to your question is that I think whatever frameworks are going to be increased or improved as we go forward need to factor about 5 things. Number one, they need to factor the issue of many of us in Africa, particularly places like Nigeria, are actually functionally illiterate. So it's very important that from the design of our systems, for example, our ATMs in general only speak 2 languages, English and French. They don't speak any indigenous languages. And certainly if you can't read or write, you need more graphics, more pictures. Another issue that I think these frameworks, as we evolve, need to factor is 50% of our population. No society is going to go anywhere if 50% of its population is not well utilized. And that 50% very specifically are our women. So I think we need to be able to encourage women to come into this ecosystem. Also, I think that our past efforts at times have looked at the youth with fear because they say, oh, the youth are tech savvy, they're the ones engaging in some of these malfeasance. But I think that we shouldn't fear the youth, we should utilize them. So we should find ways to design programs and interventions that actually use them to combat these issues rather than viewing many of them as the enemy. And bolting on to the previous 2 issues, I think it is critical now for us to build a cybersecurity solutions economic subsector. As you well know, in 2015, the African cybercrime market, let's say, in terms of solutions market, was $0.95 billion, about $1 billion. Today in 2018, depending on the estimates you use, they range from 2.32 billion all the way to 4.5 billion. And my question to us, to the regulators, to the youth, what piece of that action are Africans going to get from their own market? We're not talking about globally yet. Of course, we have to be globally competitive. Then the third thing I think we need to do is that our institutions, but also ourselves as individuals, need to build our cyber resilience. So I think that any new frameworks, the kinds of regulatory frameworks that the CBN is talking about, but like I said, whether it's the security agencies, whether it's the identity management system, whether it's the IT agencies, within Nigeria and across Africa, I think need to zero in on putting the value add of some of these factors that I've mentioned.
I really, really love those points you mentioned. But I would like to bring in something I think also is quite pertinent in there. It's when you talk about legislation, do you think legislation is struggling to catch up with the pace of growth of cybersecurity?
Definitely it is. And this is not a Nigerian problem alone. It's not an African problem alone. It's a global problem. The technology moves exponentially. And in fact, there is a famous quote by Barry Green out in Singapore. And he says, cyber criminals operate at the speed of light. law enforcement operates at the speed of law. And therefore, there is a mismatch. And the question is, if you recognize this and appreciate this, the question then becomes, what do we do? And one of the things we need to do is to make sure that our law enforcement and regulatory agencies need to be a lot more proactive. But also, in terms of developing the legislation, it's not about developing a legislation that's rigid and specifically tackles an issue, but legislation that empowers the regulator who can issue and adjust the regulations and guidelines from time to time as necessary in order to cope with this velocity or increasing pace of new types of activities and particularly crime. Don't forget, 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, who knew anything about artificial intelligence? Who knew anything about fintech? Who knew anything about the concept of demonetization? So if you insist on waiting for legislation to be passed, then obviously you are going to be even further behind. I think what our legislatures need to do in Africa, in Nigeria, where I live in particular, is to be able to put greater trust and empowerment in the regulators to be able to adjust and improve those frameworks as we move along.
Quite interesting, quite interesting. I would like now to move to the trends we're seeing. You've mentioned a couple of things: cloud technology coming in, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things springing up. All sorts coming in there. I want to know that I would like you to speak to the trends we're seeing playing out here.
Well, again, if you boil down these trends, there are still some fundamental similarities. At the end of the day, what are the challenges we face? Frankly, a big challenge is theft. Whether it is theft of property, theft of money, theft of intellectual property, and also, of course, the big one now, theft of identity. So that's an area that, whether it's on the cloud or whatever the platform, continues to worry all of us. But also, as you've correctly pointed out, the vectors are beginning to change. In the past, the threat vectors are a little different. Today we have things like viruses, we have email spamming. Certainly, most of us have heard about issues relating to social engineering. So these vectors, frankly, are platform independent. They happen on the cloud, they happen on Facebook, they happen on Google, and moving on. But now we also have an addition to the menu, which are issues such as disruptors, and they are not necessarily criminal or even by bad actors. But robotics is a disruptor. It's going to change, frankly, how we interact with things. Cognitive intelligence that you mentioned, the artificial intelligence. Today, for example, there are systems that have been developed that can review contracts. Now, there's a particular bank in the US that decided to adopt this artificial intelligence system, and they've saved themselves about 247,000 billable legal hours per year. Now, whatever a billable legal hour is, whether it's $50 or $300 per hour, it amounts to a lot of money. But more importantly, as a disruption, it means that if you are a young person going to study law of contracts today, you actually might not have a profession to practice by the time you finish. And of course, we have other disruptors such as blockchain, which are aiding the fintech industry, which of course banks view with a lot of trepidation. There are other issues. For example, today, the bad actors are no longer individuals just trying to scrape a living. They are actually digital crime syndicates, and they actually are very sophisticated. They are multi-country. So this changes, because you must bear in mind that our commercial or our financial sector has become a very commercial ecosystem. So for example, let's say today you are a bank and you focus on making sure that you have your networks to be very safe. But what if the power company network is not safe and you do not have power? You have a disruption. You have situations like the Target attack in the US a couple of years ago. the hackers were able to get through the thermostat of the air conditioning system. You see? So you now have to look at systems beyond your core system, because that value chain is now under threat.
Yeah.
You also have the increasing cost, velocity, and diversity of the attack vectors. And like I said earlier, there are a lot of regulators, especially in the financial sector, that view a tech-savvy youth as a threat. And while I'm not trying to play down that threat, I think that we need to be able to find ways to use the tech-savvy youth.
I hear you. I hear you when you talk about trying to get the youth involved and get it in there. But right now. So you mentioned something that is very dear to me. You talked about cross-border crimes as well. Can you speak to the role of collaboration and how collaborating between interagencies and even governments can help check cybercrime both at a national level and even at an international level?
Well, one would argue that no country can handle cybersecurity, I'm talking in general, at the broad level, and cybercrime specifically alone. It's simply not possible. First of all, the actual costs of doing so are prohibitive. Not even the USA, with the largest economy in the world, can afford it. So how much more African countries? Now, even if you have the money, do you have the capacity, the human resource capacity, and understanding of the issues? Again, some of these things are quite specialized. Even if you have that, assuming, the question is, if somebody in Tokyo hacks a server in Accra to basically attack an individual account in Lagos, and the money is transferred to Pretoria, South Africa, and maybe from there it is now spent in Kenya, the question is, which police force has the primary authorization to be able to investigate all of those machines? And the truth is that none. Now, you have a system of multilateral agreements, the MLATs, but they're very, very slow and tedious. Sometimes just to get an MLAT approval to interrogate a person or a system in another country might take 6 months, 9 months. Of course, in cyberspace terms, that's a century. So we do need to come up with better ways of collaborating, and there are. And we found where, for example, private sector companies such as Microsoft have been able to collaborate with the EFCC and the FBI to be able to take down particular servers that are, doing malfeasance. So those collaborative mechanisms, they are voluntary by nature.
Okay.
But the issue is that it's a mentality. So, for example, today in Nigeria, how well does the police cooperate with the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission? How well do they collaborate or cooperate with the intelligence agencies?
So you're saying more interagency cooperation is needed, and then to
absolutely.
Also, yeah. Okay. I need you to hold that thought there. We need to go to a quick break, and when we return, we'll continue our conversation. I've been speaking to Abdul-Hakeem Ajijola, is the executive chairman of Consultancy Support Services. Still with me to discuss cybercrime regulation in Nigeria is Abdul-Hakeem Ajijola. He's the executive chairman of Consultancy Support Services. Abdul-Hakeem, as we were speaking earlier, I'd like to bring it back home to Nigeria now. We've talked about a lot of issues here, a lot of things, issues have been raised. But I'd like to speak to budgeting. As a country, the amount of how much we put into budgeting for cybersecurity. Do you think this is actually adequate?
Well, the quick answer is no. But like I've said earlier, no country has the kind of money required for the budget. The second issue I think that is very important for me to point out is that when you talk of budgeting, the presumption is that it's government budget and therefore government is doing it. And I think this is a misreading of what cybersecurity in particular is about. Cybersecurity really is a risk management issue, not necessarily, men in dark goggles with guns in their holster. It's not necessarily a direct security issue. So I think if we begin to look at it more of a risk management issue, then we would appreciate that there is greater need for a more active role by the private sector, and maybe for government, while it does definitely have very, very important roles, to act much more as the referee, the coordinator, the regulator, to establish and maintain the frameworks, but basically to enable an empowered private sector to be able to actually go after the issues and most of the solutions, bearing in mind who owns the banks. In the main, the private sector. Who owns the infrastructure, the telecoms infrastructure? In the main, the private sector. So really, I don't think that we should, as a society now, unduly rely on government and its epileptic budgets.
Yeah, so
Even if the budgets were good, I wouldn't want us to rely on them.
Yeah, but as government, each government has their national priorities because, they want to be able to know that they can safeguard critical infrastructure. They also want to know that they can readily combat cyber threats. So how do you advise that they go on with this?
Okay, if I may twist your phrase a little bit, what government needs to do is to make sure that the critical infrastructure is protected, not necessarily do the protection. So for example, you have a small country in Northern Europe called Estonia. Estonia is at the forefront of all these things. And what has Estonia done? Basically, Estonia has created a civilian-based cybersecurity system, which during times of national emergency interfaces with the security agencies. But that means that they do regular drills together. The truth of the matter is that somebody who is in the private sector that manages a network on a day-to-day basis is going to be far more proficient than somebody in the public sector who probably just looks at the networks from time to time. So yes, government does have a very, very important strategic role, high-level role, setting the framework, making sure there are rules, making sure the rules are obeyed, providing sanction when the rules are contravened, but again, not necessarily at every level implementing. So I would much rather see the Nigerian government and other African governments implement some kind of collaborative ecosystem where they bring in the private sector, bring in the civil society. Civil society is excellent at monitoring, for example, monitoring and evaluation. And nobody can say that because you're in government, you are more patriotic than somebody who is not in government. I don't think that would be a correct assessment. So I think if government can focus on the ecosystem development, then you'll have a better set of outcomes.
Yes, I hear you when you talk about focusing on the ecosystem. But I'd like to also bring in the very important angle of skill set. As a country, if you're going to protect national infrastructure, if you're going to protect a lot of these cyber attacks that are coming in, you also have to have the skill set within your country to be able to address this. How do you think we can better structure for this? Is it more in promoting STEM subjects from the secondary school level, or encouraging people to learn coding, or how do you think we can best skill up to meet what is obtainable globally?
Well, first of all, I think there are a couple of areas that, again, we need to focus on. Capacity building is sine qua non. You have to have it. But capacity building is awareness, so for the general user, but also training and specific teaching and learning. So yes, right from the nursery, primary level, you do need to be able to convey some awareness to our kids. Today we have children, and I'm sure most of your viewers know of children 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old. Give them a laptop or a tablet or a mobile phone. They will do wonderful things. Who's teaching them how to be safe? Then you now go, yes, you need to have specific interventions in the syllabus at the primary, at the secondary, and at the tertiary. And clearly at the tertiary institution level, you need to also be able to have specific courses. We have a few universities here in Nigeria, FUT Mina very specifically. I think they are graduating their 4th or 5th set of people who studied cybersecurity and, of course, cybercrime and related issues. So yes, we need those kind of formal environments. But also, I would encourage government. Government has a number of academic institutions which are entry points to different cadres, for example, within the public service. You have the Public Service Institute here in Abuja. You have ALSCON in Badagry. You have NIPS in Jos. Now, it would be a good idea, in my opinion, to develop some kind of syllabus or course for each of those type of academic institutions, so that it's not a question of creating simply a special cadre of experts, but lift everybody in the system at least one step. Lift them up one step in terms of awareness. Because there is a system is only as strong as its weakest link. So if you have a very sophisticated system within the central bank, but one of the tellers within, Bank X in Abakaliki, for example, is careless, that could be the door opener.
So you're just suggesting leaving no one behind, basically, just taking everybody on board.
Leave no one behind, precisely.
Okay, very interesting. I'd like to also talk to you now on the issues around data protection,
Yes.
Privacy, and then fundamental human rights, because these are also issues that also have to be considered by the central bank when putting up this regulation.
Correct. Well, privacy is a very touchy issue. As you know, we're all concerned about the quantum of information that any entity holds about us. But I think also that many of us are really misinformed. As I sit here with you today, 90% of the people listening, their privacy has long bolted out of the barn. They've gone on Facebook, they've gone on Twitter, they've sent emails, they've shared their business cards with everybody. You have no idea where your private information already resides. So while I'm not against or opposed to very stringent privacy regulations, I just want us to understand that it is because we're a bit ignorant about the quantum of our personal data that's already out there that we feel we have a lot to protect. Now, having said that, of course, we need to have very stringent rules and regulations. The Cybercrime Act of 2015, which was signed into law in 2015, actually does begin to touch on some of those issues. But I also know that, prior to the kickstart of what I would call the political season, our Senate was actually working on a dedicated privacy bill. And of course, they were studying bills from other countries. There is definitely a need for a greater level of regulation, be it through an act of parliament or be it through some of the regulatory agencies in terms of protecting our privacy and also providing sanction for those who willfully violate it and those who also exploit it for negative purposes.
I'd like to talk about around the ethics, the ethics of regulating, cybercrime around the world. We know countries want to have the edge over the other country, and sometimes they engage in, practices that might be termed unethical. I'd like you to speak to this point.
Well, I think, first of all, it's not just countries, it's not just state actors, but also a lot of non-state actors. There's a group I work with. I'm a commissioner on the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace. And this is out of The Hague in the Netherlands. And what we are doing as a group is actually developing a series of norms for operations in cyberspace. So for example, the first set of norms we came up with was that you should not attack the core infrastructure of cyberspace. For example, if Nigeria and Ghana are having a dispute, Ghana shouldn't go and cut the cable beyond its shores, the fiber cable, because not only will it affect Nigeria, it will affect all the countries all the way down to Angola, and up to South Africa. So globally, there are a lot of conversations about the development of these norms. We've had norms, for example, in traditional warfare, for example, where soldiers shouldn't attack children, women, hospitals, schools, and the like. And we now need to develop, the world is developing similar norms for cyberspace, for cybersecurity, for cybercrime. My concern is that Africa is not really in the discussions as it should be. Yes, there are one or two of us there, but really, when, for example, the Geneva Convention was developed, Africa was not asked, but yet we have to comply with it. So now that these new set of norms, or a new generation of norms are being developed, Africa really, really needs to insert itself in these conversations, because it's not simply about taking the ethics of the West or the East, but what are really our ethics as Africans?
Thanks so much for your time, Abdul-Hakeem. Very, very interesting perspective you've shared so far on the show. I've been speaking to Abdul-Hakeem Ajijola, the Executive Chairman of Consultancy Support Services. And that's all we have on today's episode of Beyond Markets. Thank you for joining us. As always, you can watch all previous episodes of Beyond Markets on our website at cnbcafrica.com and stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets. Follow me at Kenneth Igbomo. Do have a wonderful evening.